interests me are not just the sordid little stories of Hollywood. Somehow they transcend into tragedy.
Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Watkins, and welcome back to Between the Dial, a project dedicated to plotting a roadmap straight through the dark heart of Los Angeles, with the hopes of uncovering the hidden geographies that sit right atop our own. And I am happy to say, friends, that we have finally made it back. Welcome to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. The gate you see in front of us is not the original gate, but you can learn more about that by listening to the first episode in this season. This, however, is part 3 of our story about the murder of William Desmond Taylor. If you are all caught up, then let's start walking. If not, go back and listen to parts 1 and 2, and we will be right here when you're done. Alright then, let's stay on the road and head straight back and follow it as it curves to the left. I'll continue our story along the way, so back to 1922. We now have a new name on the scene. Detective Sergeant Edward King, a star detective with the LAPD and someone we will certainly talk about in a future episode, I'm sure, has just been put on the case. And in short order, using the bullets pulled from Taylor's body, he and his team were able to determine the type of gun used in the murder. It was an older model snub-nosed pistol, a .38 caliber. King figured, based on where Taylor's body landed and the placement of the bullet, that he likely stood up from his desk and raised his arms in the air. Taylor's ex-wife had remarried and was still in New York, so they were able to rule her out as a potential suspect. Taylor's ledger, however, was of some interest. King found that many checks had been written out to cash, leading detectives to believe that perhaps Taylor was being extorted. To add to the noise and speculation, the press, operating on hunches and hearsay, began running stories that invented wild extracurriculars for William Desmond Taylor. Some said that due to his quote-unquote womanizing ways, that he was killed by a jealous lover. Others said that he was a thief. Others that he was gay, and still others that he was a drug addict. All of this to say that the studio bosses over at Famous Players Lasky were in full damage control mode. So while they plotted their next move, King decided to explore this jealous lover angle. The first stop was Mabel Norman's house, as according to Taylor's valet, Henry Peavy, she was the last confirmed person to see Taylor alive. Mabel pulled herself out of bed when she heard the knock at the door and gladly invited the detectives in, When they asked if they could take a look around, she was more than happy to oblige. A fact made more surprising when, after only a few minutes, the detectives found 2 loaded snub-nosed revolvers in Mabel's bedroom. They, however, were 25s, not 38s. Meanwhile, back at Famous Players Lasky, Charles Eighton finished rifling through the boxes of effects from William Desmond Taylor's apartment, with his bosses Jesse Lasky and Adolf Zucker. The items they saw fit for the eyes of investigating authorities were placed back in the boxes, and those that could paint the movie colony in a potentially scandalous light were placed in a safe at Famous Players Lasky. Eighton then set about returning the box to Taylor's home so that it could be processed with the rest of the crime scene. However, Eighton's trip back to the Alvarado Court apartments came with an additional mission attached. Zucker wanted the rumors of Taylor's homosexuality banished from the headlines, and so once he handed the boxes back over to detectives, he slipped upstairs and planted a letter from Mabel Normand in one of Taylor's boots, to sow rumors that they were more than good friends. Then, to enhance Taylor's reputation as a ladies' man, Eighton also placed a woman's handkerchief with the monogrammed initials M.M.M. in a book on Taylor's shelf. The triple M, of course, standing for Mary Miles Minter. Speaking of Minter, since the outset of the investigation, Detective Ed King was plagued by the suspicion that Minter knew more than she was letting on. In fact, he was convinced that the keys to solving this murder ran straight through the front door of Mary Miles Minter and her mother, Charlotte Shelby. And persistent though he was, it took forever for King to persuade District Attorney Thomas Woolwine to bring Minter in for questioning. You see, Woolwine had his sights set on the governor's mansion, and knew that implicating one of the biggest stars of the day was a good way to turn the studios against you. Lose their influence, and you could easily lose an election. But there was actually a little more to it than even that. You see, years earlier, D.A. Thomas Woolwine and Minter's mother, Charlotte Shelby, had a brief, clandestine affair with one another. However, despite all of this, Woolwine eventually concedes and agrees to interview Mary Miles Minter regarding her whereabouts on February 1st. But he insists on conducting the interview alone, cutting King out of his chance to really put the screws to the young and Taylor-obsessed ingenue. King was predictably livid, but he didn't take it lying down, and instead endeavored to get to Mary Miles Minter before her appointment with Thomas Woolwine. Without Woolwine's knowledge, Ed King showed up at Minter's home now 5 days after the murder to find her predictably confused. She had a meeting scheduled at the station in a few days, but King assured her, falsely, that this was just a preliminary interview. Minter, being 19 years old, accepted that without question and invited the detective in. Minter told King that she hadn't visited Taylor in some time, confessing that the most recent visit was about a month ago when she showed up at his apartment seeking, quote, closure in their relationship. Regarding the night of the murder, Minter said that that night she spent a quiet evening at home with her mother and her sister. Friendly alibis, but alibis nonetheless. William Desmond Taylor's funeral took place at St. Paul's Cathedral at 2 p.m. Mary Miles Minter did not attend. It isn't known if her absence was her own decision or if she was somehow prevented from attending by her mother, Charlotte Shelby, who, as you may recall, was not Taylor's biggest fan. Mabel Normand attended and was reported to have been despondent, and at one point fainted and had to be escorted from the service. Perhaps she was still plagued by the thought that her former drug connections could have been the ones responsible for the murder. Detectives began to widen their search beyond the confines of the Alvarado Court Apartments, and in doing so learned that on the evening of Taylor's death, a man in a cap entered a gas station asking for directions to the home of William Desmond Taylor. A man matching that same description was later seen boarding a streetcar near Taylor's apartment later that night. Furthermore, Faith McLean, Doug McLean's wife and Taylor's neighbor, told police that she saw a man who she described as, quote, not well dressed and wearing a cap, walking away from Taylor's unit shortly after she heard the gunshots. At first glance, she thought it was Ed Sands, Taylor's former valet, the one who robbed him and sent him the pawn tickets. But she later dismissed that notion because Sands had a distinct, bow-legged way of walking, and the man leaving Taylor's apartment did not. Finding this man in the cap seems as though it would be the key to solving the murder, but without more to go on, it would wind up as one of many dead ends. When Woolwine found out that Detective King had gone behind his back to speak with Minter, he was furious. He told him to steer clear of any future interactions with that family. Woolwine was convinced that the investigation should be focusing its attention on Ed Sands. And it's not like they weren't trying to, but at this point no one had been able to track him down. And privately, King remained fixated on the Minter family. He kept his distance from the central parties and instead focused in on their employees and associates. In doing so, King learned that Charlotte Shelby had accused William Desmond Taylor of indulging and even encouraging her daughter's crush on him. Most, however, said that that was absolutely not the case. They stated that Taylor was cordial, but not reciprocal. A few even went so far as to call Mary Miles Minter a stalker, which obviously did nothing to deter King from continuing this path of inquiry. He spoke with Charlotte Shelby's former secretary, who stated that Charlotte was always chasing men away from her daughters, and did concede that Charlotte owned a .38 caliber handgun. In fact, that was the gun that Mary used to fake her suicide attempt that I spoke about last week. King also asked about Margaret, Mary's sister, who was also reportedly present at the Minter house on the night of the murder. The secretary said that Margaret was a somewhat wayward individual and often indulged in one too many drinks. All of this information, troubling though it may have been, was barely circumstantial when it came to evidence. In the eyes of the law, Ed Sands was still their man, but he was also seemingly impossible to find. And so the months dragged on. Taylor's apartment was cleaned and re-rented. His possessions were sold off. In fact, Louis B. Mayer, the man who would one day become the head of MGM, actually bought his car. Detective King was grasping at straws and looking for Hail Marys. No pun intended. One of those straws came in the form of a plan he concocted with a local spiritualist. King paid the man a sum of money to plant a story in the press that he had had a vision that, quote, a desperate mother of a beautiful young actress killed William Desmond Taylor. King hoped that this would rattle Charlotte Shelby enough to grant him an interview. It did not. So, feeling as though he were running in circles, King decides he needs to go back to square one. So he heads down to the evidence locker to re-examine the suit Taylor was murdered in. To his astonishment, King is informed by the officer in evidence that the box of Taylor's effects was ordered destroyed, as it was determined to be, quote, non-essential. Shocked, King demanded to know where the items were sent, and was told that it was the same mortuary that had processed Taylor's body. The Ivy Overholser mortuary at 1719 Flower Street. That address no longer exists, and the 10 currently runs over the top of it. Or else we would have gone there, I promise. Anyway, King arrives to learn that the evidence had thankfully not yet been incinerated. So he pulls out Taylor's suit and goes over each thread with a magnifying glass. And this effort actually got him somewhere. Underneath Taylor's collar, he found 3 long blonde hairs that bore a striking resemblance to those found on the head of Mary Miles Minter. King then headed over to Lasky and paid a delivery boy to sneak into Minter's dressing room and steal some hairs from her hairbrush. He did, and King had them examined, and it was determined that they were a match. Surely he thought this would be enough to turn Woolwine onto the idea of putting more pressure on Charlotte Shelby. But no. The DA held firm in his position, which unfortunately did him little good, as Thomas Woolwine lost his bid for governor of California. And 2 years later, he would be diagnosed with cancer, forcing him to resign as district attorney. A man by the name of Asa Keys took over the position, but by that point, the Taylor case had gone ice cold and had long been out of the public eye. For Detective King, however, it was still priority number 1. He would spend his days trotting and retrotting the same evidence, hoping to find something that was missed or misinterpreted. And of course, with enough looking, he did. Charlotte Shelby had told Thomas Woolwine that her accountant, Marjorie Berger, who also worked for Minter and Mabel Normand, had told her about the murder of William Desmond Taylor before it was known by the news services. This is obviously a big deal because to know about the murder before the press, you would either have to have been one of Taylor's neighbors or been somehow involved in the killing. Or so King thought. It wasn't, however, until he met with Marjorie that she told him that he had it backwards. She said that it was Charlotte who told her about the murder before the news hit the press. This, plus the hairs found on Taylor's jacket, was all the convincing the new DA needed to finally grant Detective King his interview with Charlotte Shelby. And it was anticlimactic. Shelby turned on the charm and played the role of the sweet, doting mother to a T, contrary to all contemporary accounts of her reputation. She was asked about her disdain for William Desmond Taylor, and Shelby objected at the very notion. She said she thought Taylor was a charming man and a wonderful mentor to her daughter. King pressed her about the .38 caliber snub-nosed pistol that she owned, and she claimed that she threw that thing away years ago. And that was that. So King did what he did when he couldn't get any farther with one member of the Minter family. He switched to another member of the Minter family, this time back to Mary. He wanted to inquire about the hairs on Taylor's jacket and to finally ask her, point blank, if her mother had anything to do with Taylor's death. But talking to Mary now meant traveling to New York City. No longer a teenager and no longer an actor, Mary Miles Minter had retired from the movie business and now lived the luxurious life of a New York socialite. In her interview with King, Mary insists that she and Taylor did have a romance. King, no longer mincing his words, asked her if the relationship was sexual. Minter confessed that it was not. Then King asked Minter the million-dollar question. Did your mother ever threaten to kill William Desmond Taylor? And Mary said, yes. Before adding that she always threatened to kill everyone. King knew that that was as far as he was going to get with Mary Miles Minter. We're rounding the turn now, so keep your eyes peeled to the left and you'll see the grave of voice actor Mel Blanc, with the inscription, quote, "That's all, folks." It's funny. Just wanted to point that out. Now, if you look to your right, you will see a large mausoleum building called the Abbey of the Psalms. Jesse Lasky Sr., William Desmond Taylor's boss at Famous Players Lasky, the one responsible for removing any scandalous material from Taylor's apartment, was actually interred there in 1958. You can pay him a visit if you like, but we will be visiting the Abbey of the Psalms at a later date for a different story. Anyway, by now in our story, the 1920s are over, and movies are no longer silent. The Great Depression had hit the United States, but Charlotte Shelby was still living well. On a particularly beautiful Southern California day, she was lounging in her home when her lawyer paid her a visit. He had the unfortunate news that her oldest daughter, Mary's sister Margaret, was suing her. You see, I mentioned a while back that Margaret liked to enjoy a drink or two, but that indulging eventually gave way to full-blown alcoholism, and Shelby had had her daughter committed to a sanitarium and her assets frozen until she got clean and could prove herself competent to live alone. Well, Margaret did not get clean, but she did want her money. Now, all of this is relevant to us for one big reason. In her deposition, Margaret said that, quote, "My mother, Charlotte Shelby, killed William Desmond Taylor." She claimed that the alibi given to Detective King back in 1922 was false. Margaret claimed that neither Mary Miles Minter or her mother, Charlotte Shelby, were home on the night of William Desmond Taylor's murder. To make matters worse for Charlotte, Margaret was explicit in her desire not to settle the case, but rather intended to take it to trial. Meaning that these accusations, and potentially more, could become a matter of record in open court. Shelby was no doubt shaken by this news from her attorney, but it wasn't long before she concocted a plan. She decided to lean in and write the Los Angeles Police Department demanding an investigation, essentially into herself. The plan being that, quote, "Why would a guilty person demand an investigation?" Her old friend, Detective King, was of course more than happy to oblige. And for once, it seemed like he was actually getting somewhere. For one, when he asked Marjorie Berger, Charlotte's former secretary, if Margaret was telling the truth about the alibi, Marjorie surprisingly sided with Margaret. Then came an interview with Shelby's former valet, who claimed to King that he had access to, quote, "family secrets specifically concerning Charlotte's .38 caliber pistol." He confirmed what Charlotte said in previous interviews, that the gun was long gone. But he drew their attention to the incident of Mary Miles Minter's fake suicide attempt. As you'll recall, Mary grabbed her mother's gun, ran up to her bedroom and fired 2 shots, only to burst out in a fit of laughter when members of the household ran upstairs in a panic. He told Detective King that Charlotte had ordered him to dispose of the 2 discarded shells. But he didn't do as he was told. He instead placed them on a beam in the basement of Charlotte Shelby's home and suggested that they were probably still there today. Luckily for the LAPD, Charlotte Shelby no longer resided at the address in question, and the new homeowners were more than happy to allow detectives to search the basement. And it didn't take long before they found what they were looking for. 2 discarded old-style shells from a .38 caliber snub-nosed handgun. Shells that matched both Shelby's gun and the gun used to kill William Desmond Taylor. But whether they were a precise match had yet to be determined. Margaret Minter's deposition alone was enough to grant Detective King his wish. A grand jury convened in May of 1937 to determine whether to indict Charlotte Shelby for the murder of William Desmond Taylor. 3 witnesses were scheduled to testify: Margaret Minter, Mary Miles Minter, and their mother, Charlotte Shelby. Margaret was the first to take the stand and essentially reiterated what she had said in her initial deposition, that during the night of the murder, Mary and Charlotte were not home. She said that Mary left first, followed by her mother, and that Shelby was particularly worried about a repeat of the incident with James Kirkwood. Margaret said that when Mary got home, she got into bed with her and said, quote, "Mother killed him." When Margaret asked who, Mary said, "Billy Taylor." Mary Miles Minter, now 35 years old and virtually unrecognizable as the actress she once was, testified next. And she proceeded to refute everything that her older sister had testified to. Charlotte Shelby was the last to take the stand. And unfortunately, at this point, ballistics tests had been conducted on the bullets found in the basement of her former home, and were proven to be inconclusive as a potential match for the bullets that killed William Desmond Taylor. Beyond that, she stuck close to the same story that she had been telling for over a decade: that she was home that night with her 2 daughters. But she did reveal a new alibi. Her assistant and occasional actor Carl Stockdale was also there that night, she said. Unsurprising, given Detective King's track record with this case, the grand jury decided not to indict that day. Charlotte Shelby was free to go and would not stand trial. As a sad denouement to an already very sad case, Detective King decided to pay a visit to Carl Stockdale and ask him if what Charlotte testified was true. Stockdale confirms that yes, indeed, he was there that night, and that Charlotte Shelby was telling the truth. King then asked, "Then why did you never come forward before?" To which Stockdale replied, "Because no one ever asked me." Following this, the William Desmond Taylor case was placed on inactive status, and today remains unsolved. Detective King went to his grave believing that Charlotte Shelby was the one who did it. On the last day of his life, William Desmond Taylor stopped at Robinson's department store on 7th to buy 2 books to give to Mabel Norman later that night. At noon, he went to lunch at the Los Angeles Athletic Club with a studio executive. While there, an actor named Tony Morano swings by his table and asks for advice on a contract. Taylor promises that he will call him later. At 4 p.m., he calls Mabel's housekeeper and tells her to pass along a message. Quote, "Please say that Mr. Taylor requests the honor of Ms. Norman's presence this evening." At 5 p.m., Taylor goes to a dance lesson and then walks home. At 6 p.m., a dark-haired man with a cap walks into a gas station and asks for William Desmond Taylor's address. The attendant gives it to him. 6:40 p.m., Tony Morano calls to pick back up where they left off regarding the contract at lunch. 7 p.m., Mabel Normand arrives, and Taylor presents her with the books he purchased earlier. Henry Peavy brings in the gin blossom martinis. About 7:10 p.m., a neighbor on the street behind Taylor's sees the same capped man walking in a seemingly aimless fashion before turning onto Taylor Street. For what it's worth, this neighbor thought the man looked a lot like Ed Sands. At around 7:15 p.m., the McLean family maid hears footsteps behind their home, headed to the garage next to Taylor's apartment. 7:20 p.m., Taylor dismisses Henry Peavy for the night. He and Mabel hang out together, joking around, playing the piano, that sort of thing. 7:35 p.m., Mabel says she has an early call time the next morning and tells Taylor that she must be off. Taylor helps her on with her coat and walks her to her chauffeur. He says he may give her a call a little later around 9 p.m. that night to see how she liked the books. At 7:45 p.m., Taylor watches Mabel's car drive away, breathing in the night-blooming jasmine. He then turns around and heads back inside for the last time. Mabel Normand left Hollywood right before movies started talking, and tried her hand, much like Mary Miles Minter, at being a New Yorker, although to a decidedly different degree. She took up residence in New York's Greenwich Village and surrounded herself with friends from the city's intellectual set. People like George Gershwin and Edna St. Vincent Millay. It seemed as though she was really happy there. The tragedy of which is that it did not last very long. In 1927, she fell ill with various colds and infections, which were ultimately determined to be tuberculosis. In August 1929, she moved to Monrovia, California, hoping the dry climate would do her well. But she would, unfortunately, succumb to her illness in 1930. Her nurse received her final words. Quote, "I hate to go without finding out what happened to poor Billy Taylor." And now, if we head on through the doors of the Cathedral Mausoleum, we will find his final resting place, buried under his birth name, William Dean Tanner. He's actually right around the corner from Jules Roth, the former owner of the cemetery who we spoke about a few episodes back. I encourage you to spend some time, leave some flowers, and join me again next week. I thought that this would be the end of our talk about William Desmond Taylor, but the story just gets denser and denser the more you look. So if you've followed me this far, I promise the ending will be worth it. In fact, I have a really fun story to share about something that happened right on this very spot in front of Taylor's grave. Before I go, I'd like to give a large amount of praise to Hollywood and Crime. They deserve a big citation when it came to compiling that timeline, so a big thank you to them and to you. And as always, please drive safely. Between the Dial was written, produced, and narrated by me, Daniel Watkins. If you like the music you're listening to right now, that is by Chestnut. And if you like horror movies, myself and Christina Santa Cruz are hosting horror movies, vampire style, every Wednesday in September and October over on landturtlerecords.com. That's landturtlerecords.com. All the info you'll need for how to watch is there. Have a good night, y'all.